Hello, fellow human beings. This is Robert Roach with the Type 1 Planet podcast, and today I had an amazing conversation with Robin Hanson. He is a world-renowned economist, polymath, futurist thinker. He's the origin of some brilliant ideas, including the great filter response to the Fermi paradox. Professionally, he's the associate professor of economics at George Mason University and a research associate at the Future of Humanity Institute of Oxford University. And he's the author of some amazing books like The Age of M, which explores the possibility of emulating human brains and the social and economic impacts of that kind of technology, along with some other amazing books that are all listed in the show notes. I was really lucky to get to talk to Robin today, and he had some amazing and incredible information for me. We went into what the Type 1 Planet model looks like. I described it to him, and he had scrutiny and questions and feedback for a model like that, which is idealistic in many ways. Robin made it very clear that just listing the characteristics of what you want in a civilization is not going to give you mechanisms of how to bring that kind of civilization about. So first and foremost, we got into economics and what the potential economic system of a long-term sustainable civilization would need to look like. What is the economic best-case scenario for humanity? And with everything, it's a trade-off. You cannot just maximize the genetic diversity of our planet while maximizing the well-being and richness of humanity and maximizing equality for every person. So we get into it. And Robin has a wealth of knowledge in the space. He's a brilliant thinker. We talked a lot about implementing institutional systems and mechanisms to make decision as a civilization and how to prioritize and incentivize scientific discoveries as a civilization, how to use betting markets, financial incentives to create a civilization where we want to collectively make decisions and make discoveries as a species. The conversation honestly could have been 4 hours long. We cut it off at just short of an hour. Robin said he was interested in coming back on. That would be incredible because we only scratched the surface. But these kinds of ideas are going to be a big part of the Type 1 Planet discussion. We're going to get into it in future conversations to better understand how we can click into new mechanisms as a civilization that help us make decisions better, do better research, do political processes better, economic processes. So stick with us. Visit us at type1planet.net, at Type1Planet on social media. Give us feedback, give us ideas, engage with us, and stay tuned. Okay, hello and welcome to the Type 1 Planet podcast. This is your host, Robert Roach, and I'm joined today by Robin Hanson. Robin, thank you so much for joining me for a little bit of time today.
Nice to meet you all.
So, Robin, I just wanted to quickly review and describe the mission of the organization to act as a frame for this conversation. We're attempting to design a model of civilization which a few key things are true. The civilization can exist for a minimum of thousands of years into the future, harnessing the energy needed for that population while preserving the maximum amount of genetic diversity on the planet. We're in a peaceful, sustainable equilibrium between factions of the dominant species and in relation to other species on the planet. And then the species is achieving a 100% democratization of scientific knowledge specifically, while consistently expanding and preserving scientific knowledge. And one of the biggest challenges that we've been encountering in these conversations and this model building that we're working on, and the reason I want to talk to you is we're having a difficult understanding of where the role of capitalism and competition and the open market comes into while facilitating a long-term sustainable global civilization. And so my first kind of question for you, and maybe the only query we get into this entire episode is, we're looking for advice on how to proceed here. What does an economy of a Type 1 planet theoretically need to look like? What is the economic best case scenario for a biosphere? I want to see if you've done any thinking or any work on this space.
So you have a number of criteria, and I'm not sure which you care about more because they may be in conflict.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
First, you just may want stuff to work. And, you may want to delegate tasks to different people and have those people focus on their task and make it work, and then have it all combined together into a total civilization. You might want that total civilization to just have a high capacity. Like it could just do a lot if it wanted. And you might want that capacity to increase with time, i.e. to have growth. So that's the main reason you'd want capitalism is so that you have a system that just is rich and capable, and that capability will grow. So most of the alternatives to capitalism you will consider will come at the cost of those things. You may prefer to pay that price, but that would be the key price you're paying. Just having stuff work effectively, having it adapt to different situations, and having it get better over time. That will let civilization do all the different things you want to do that it wants to do better. Of course, capitalism may also give power to other people, not you, to do what they want, not what you want. And that may also be part of your problem. So your next criteria here might be you wanted a maximum genetic diversity. It's not clear what that means. So for example, 500 million years ago, there was the famous Cambrian explosion, where previous mostly single cellular life were replaced wholesale dramatically with a vast diversity of multicellular life. By different measures, that was a reduction in genetic diversity, because now all the diversity was focused in this, what was previously a small lineage of creatures, and the other lineages were pushed aside, and this previously small lineage spread, but then it induced a lot of diversity within itself. And, was that good or bad by your measure? That's relevant for what's about to happen soon on Earth. It could be that humans end up expanding and pushing aside lots of other diversity and making that other diversity less, but then having enormous diversity within the new human lineage and the new human legacies that we spread out and do. And then, that may go off into space, into kinds of artificial minds and artificial intelligence. It can go off in lots of directions, but depending on how you measure it, that might count as more versus less genetic diversity. So I might need to ask you what you wanted exactly.
Yeah, that's a great question, and this is wonderful scrutiny. Thank you. In terms of genetic diversity, there's a useful factor of genetic diversity for human beings. For example, we can use diverse genomes to determine, for example, treatments for different kinds of diseases. We can understand better, why is it that a xenopist frog species is able to withstand sort of genetic treatments and that kind of stuff, and go from there. And so preserving that kind of special knowledge that, it took billions of years to develop, that losing access to that information, I think is a big part of that model, and thinking about that. And in terms of capitalism and trying to understand economic growth, it's something that we're struggling with, because using economic growth as a model for understanding, how do we have nicer, newer stuff? How do we have things that work? How do we are able to enrich ourselves as a species? But we have very scarce and limited resources on this planet. So how are those? How is economic growth on a capitalistic scale possible over thousands of years? Is that something? Will it have to evolve? Will it have to change in terms of how we understand it today?
Well, humanity at the moment is honestly using only a tiny fraction of all the available resources. So even a tiny fraction of Earth. So compared to what's possible if we go wild with technology and growth, we could easily be using only one part in a trillion or something.
Really?
Of all the available resources, even on the planet. So if you just think of raw mass, we're hardly touching any of the mass. You think of the energy, even from the sun, we're still only taking a tiny fraction of the energy from the sun. There's vastly more energy possible if we go wild with nuclear energy of various sorts. And then there's the whole rest of the solar system, vastly more energy from the sun that just comes from Earth, and vastly more raw material, not just in the outside the sun, but in the sun itself. Just counting in those terms, we are only using a tiny fraction of all the resources. But what may bother you, though, is that we may be using a substantial fraction of the resources that the current biosphere uses. So that as we use more of the resources of those sort, the biosphere will contract. There'll be less scope for the wild if we use more of that. And that may be more what you mean by using resources. It might be focused on those. And then the question is, how could we use all the other resources in the solar system without messing with those, if that's what you mean? Or we could ask, how important is it that we not mess with those?
Interesting. Okay. What's the grabby alien scenario look like? Is there another species in existence in a grabby alien scenario?
Well, so I've just been talking about this solar system. So we're only using a tiny fraction of resources on Earth, which is only a tiny fraction of resources in the solar system, which is only a tiny fraction of resources in the galaxy, which is only a tiny fraction of resources between here and the nearest other grabby aliens. So grabby aliens, on average, would appear roughly every million galaxies. On average, each civilization would have roughly a million galaxies to take before it ran into others. And so if we become grabby, that's roughly our average take. And that's even far more resources.
Okay. Yeah.
And of course, it's possible that when we met other alien civilizations, there might be conflict and maybe we could win those and there'd be even more, but that's less clear. We could win, but certainly one of our big issues is, will we become grabby at all? Because we might limit ourselves just to this solar system or even just to this planet.
Okay.
And then we would forego the nearest million galaxies of resources, which would be used by the other grabby aliens when they get here in roughly 1 billion years.
Right. Or a fraction of a second if they appear in the sky above us.
Right. But the odds are they're on average, they're going to take about 1 billion years to get here.
Sure.
So that gives us lots of time that we could be using these resources if we wanted. But again, there's the question of at what cost do these resources come? What else did you want to do with them? So if you wanted them to be supporting the current kind of biosphere in its current form, then that causes a conflict.
Sure. Okay.
Because humans at the moment are looking to those resources as easy grabs for expanding our activity. And, but, again, so with the genetic diversity thing, there's the diversity of all those animals and plants out there that are not human, but then there's all the diversity of what we could become if we allowed ourselves to do so, which includes not just diversity of, how we do our biochemicals, but diversity of our whole economy and our space of possible minds and all the ways we could, have for thinking and computing, and then all the different places we could go.
So assuming that we'll put resources aside for now, assuming that, yes, okay, we actually do have the resources that we need to survive for a long time. And we're only using a fraction, as you said, of what's available here on the planet. Then how would you say, looking at the way that our whole society is structured right now, do you think that we're on a trajectory now to be surviving for a very long time, for thousands of years, and very long time on a human lifetime scale, not on any other scale than that? Let's say 10,000 years. Or does our model civilization, does our economy need to evolve? Do those institutions that are structuring our lives need to evolve in order to have that sort of long-term survival?
So I guess we have to ask, what are the destruction scenarios that you're concerned about that would prevent our long-term survival? Now, you might think we might survive, but not in a form you appreciate or admire. And then you could think, yes, we survive, but that doesn't count in your mind. And you might ask, how long could we maintain the kind of civilization we have now that you like? That's more fragile because there's lots of things that could threaten the kind of civilization you have now that you like, in terms of its average wealth or cultural habits or things like that. But if we're talking about just anything like us or anything that descends from us, I think we have a pretty good chance of lasting for 10,000 years. It's more the question of what form we will take in that long run. Will we, for example, aggressively expand into the solar system and then the cosmos, or will we choose to put limits on our growth and change, in part because of, say, messing with the biosphere here? And then we have a bunch of other reasons why many people, I think, would find it attractive to limit growth and change. So I'm pretty sure that there'll be something in 10,000 years, although one of the things I'm worried about is that if we limit our growth and evolution and capitalism in too many ways, we will sort of produce a regime of rot where some system locks in, won't allow change, and then slowly decays over time. And then we could still be here in 10,000 years with a much decayed version of ourselves.
Interesting. Which we typically do see when there's intervention over a open capitalistic market. Too much intervention. There tends to be a lot of rot in that. in that civilization?
Well, we've just seen consistently off history, empires rise and fall. And apparently part of the reason empires fall is rot. So even if they aren't that capitalist, there's just a lot of different ways in which an empire collects structures inside itself that, entrench themselves and then decay.
How do we deal with inequality in capitalism? There's a lot of blame game going around, these days with billionaires
sure.
and people blaming individuals, where I think you would say it's more of an institutional issue and or an institutional causation. They're not just like there's 5 people that are ruining it for everyone.
So there's a book by a man named Scheidler called The Great Leveler, which gives the plausible thesis that the main dynamic of inequality in history is that in times of peace and prosperity, it slowly rises, and then it falls in times of great destruction and disaster, like civil wars, pandemics, world wars, things like that. And certainly that fits the last few centuries. And so the story is that wars and great disasters really hurt the rich more than the poor. They undermine the previous structures that the rich had and relied on. To pay for wars, we basically tax the hell out of the rich. And the rich just get squashed in big times of disasters and wars. And enormous inequality is reduced. After these big times of destruction, everybody's more poor, but the rich have been fallen further than the poor did. And then in times of peace and prosperity, slowly we reaccumulate more capital. And just there's random variation where some people make better choices than others and they get richer than others. And so slowly over time, inequality increases. So relative to that default, you'd say, well, the most likely scenario under which inequality falls is another big set of disasters, like huge pandemics, world wars, civil wars, things like that. So first of all, you probably shouldn't hope for that. You're probably better off in a world which stays peaceful and prosperous for longer, even if there's more inequality. But relative to this trajectory, we could also ask, well, what other levers could there be to reduce inequality? And one of the most obvious levers is insurance. That is, literally, insurance is the private capitalist mechanism by which, when you foresee future inequality, you reduce it for yourself by basically agreeing that if you do well, you will pay out, and if you do poorly, you will get paid into. That's what insurance is. And so you might ask the question, why don't more people want to buy more poverty insurance or, success versus failure insurance? That in some sense is the capitalist question. Now you can force it on people. You can say, make people take more insurance than they wanted to take. And in some sense, a welfare state does that. It forces more insurance on people than they would choose for themselves. And maybe you think they aren't making good choices about it. And so obviously in the last century, a large fraction of the rich world has chosen to produce what we call a welfare state, where there is enforced insurance to some degree, i.e. redistribution. And that is moderating inequality to some degree. And so you could ask, well, do people want more moderation than that? Or do they like inequality, at least, relative to the other option? So I would think the key thing is to make sure this sort of poverty insurance is available to people. And if for some reason the private market isn't offering it, maybe because of regulations or, other random factors, just make sure it's available. Just say, make sure that there is fairly priced poverty insurance available to people, long-term insurance, and even let them commit to it relatively early. Maybe even let parents commit their children to some sort of poverty insurance long before their uncertainty is realized, if they really want it.
That's interesting. Does something like this exist already?
Well, people do have various kinds of insurance that do correlate with things going well or not. Obviously, if your house burns down, that's bad for your wealth.
Right.
So if you get fire insurance against your house going down, that is a degree of
modularly existing
insurance. Also, just employment itself is a form of insurance. I think people don't quite realize that. In a world where each person was an independent contractor working by themselves, they would just face a lot more random variation in their income. When you have employment by a steady employer, basically the investors in that venture are taking a lot of the risk that you don't. They're getting paid in part for that risk. That's one of the reasons they'll get richer than you, but you don't want to take all that risk, which is why you take a job.
Mm-hmm.
A job is literally a kind of insurance.
You hear that? Millennials, get out there. No, this is reminding.
So in that sense, we have a lot of insurance, right? If you say, where's the insurance? Like when most people have jobs, they're not independent contractors, they're not self-employed. Right. That's insurance. Okay.
Yeah.
And then there are many other kinds of insurance we have. So certainly people are buying a lot of insurance. And in addition, we have governments that force people to get more. And then even with all that, there is a substantial degree of inequality that's increasing because of this process we described. And then you have to ask, is that enough? Mm-hmm. If you really wanted more, then you can either make sure people have more attractive insurance available to them if you think that's the problem, or you could just force them more to get more insurance if you think they just don't get it, that insurance is more valuable than they realize.
This is reminding me, it is a different concept, but it's reminding me of the idea that you have around idea futures and making betting markets for ideas themselves and not just for human well-being, for example. Do you know what I'm referring to when I'm saying this? Could you explain that?
Certainly, I know about betting markets in many uses. Mm-hmm. When we think about in the context of government, then I would focus on what I've called decision markets, markets that can help us make better decisions. So we could have a form of government I've called Futarchy, and in that form of government, we would agree together on the outcome we wanted, and then betting markets would tell us which policies would best get us those outcomes, and then we wouldn't have to argue about that so much. And in that outcome, we could say how important was inequality. And in that sort of a world, the way to get less inequality is to turn that dial. There's just a bunch of dials in policy, and you turn the dial and it moves you in the direction of more equality, less inequality at the expense of other things. But now you have to ask, how much did you want it compared to other things? And obviously, another dial in there would be how much of the biosphere is preserved. How much of that kind of genetics preserved? And another could be how open is science? That was another priority for you. So in some sense, I might pitch, well, if what you want is a certain set of outcomes for civilization, and then you ask, how can we get it? I might say, you're asking the wrong question. You shouldn't ask, which policies, when we argue about them, will we become persuaded those policies would get us these outcomes? What you should be asking is, how can we make a system of governance where we just say what we want, and then it figures out how to get it for us, and we don't have to figure that out. And I'm telling you, there is a form of government like that, wherein you shouldn't just focus on what kind of outcomes do we want. And then all the other clever capitalists and everyone else figure out, using profit incentives, how to get you the thing you said you wanted.
The Futarchy.
Yes.
And is this, I'm assuming this doesn't already exist.
Right. Although I could describe how a simpler version could exist that we could test just to show you. So we don't need, to reform the entire world in order to test the idea out. So think of a simple for-profit company. It has a public stock price. And usually capitalists would say the firm should be managed so as to increase the value of the firm, which is the sum total of all the stock prices of that firm, all the number of stocks times the price of the stock. So what we want to know is, for example, who should run this firm in order to achieve this result? And one important version of that is, should we fire the current CEO and replace him with somebody else? And that would happen in the context where rumors at least were suggesting this was not the best person to be running this company to achieve this purpose of maximizing the value of the company. Okay, so in that context, I'm going to show you a betting market mechanism or a market mechanism to make that choice. And the key idea here will be this will generalize to other cases. And the key thing we have here is an outcome measure we agree on as the thing we want, which is in this case, higher stock price. And the other thing we can agree on is what are the discrete options we are choosing between. In this case, fire the CEO or not fire the CEO. that's the structure we need in order to generalize what I'm about to tell you to the rest of government. And the rest of government will have to agree on some overall measure of what we want that weighs inequality and the biosphere and everything else. And we will have to have a repeated set of a discrete set of options to choose from. Like, think of bills, before the government. Someone proposes a bill, we ask, do we approve the bill or not? That's, again, a discrete choice. We repeatedly have bills proposed, and we repeatedly ask, do we approve the bill or not? And that's how we would slowly improve government, by passing the better bills. Okay, so that's where we're going. But now I'm going to show you how to do that in the simpler context. We've got a company with a CEO. The question is, should we fire the CEO with the purpose in mind, increasing the stock price of the company? All right, now, think of an ordinary stock market. In an ordinary stock market, you trade stock for cash. When you ask yourself, should you buy or sell in that stock market, what you should ask yourself is, what is the company worth? And what that means is, think of all the scenarios the company could be in the future, each of which you assign some probability to, and ask, in each of those scenarios, what's the company worth? That is, how much costs will it incur and how much revenue will it get in? And what's the difference between those two? Because that's the profit of the company, which will set what it's worth. So now, in an ordinary stock market, you just look at that average that you calculate and you ask, if the price is now too low, you should buy, because it's, the price should be higher. If the current price is higher than the number you came up with, you should sell because the current price is too high. All right, that's how you do it now. So my new proposal, which I haven't told you yet, is we're just going to make 2 new stock markets, a lot like the old one, with just one little difference. These stock markets will be called off if a condition isn't met. That is, I will buy a stock from you, I will pay you a certain amount of money, you will give me the stock, but if a certain condition isn't met, we'll just undo this trade as if it never happened. Okay, this is a called off stock
at the original price.
We're at the price we set, yes. So in a called off market, you do the same sort of game, except when you try to average over the scenarios the company could be in, you only look at the scenarios consistent with the condition you set, because otherwise the trade won't happen. So you only want to ask, under those scenarios wherein the trade does happen, what's the average value of this company? All right, we're almost there. So now we have the 2 conditions being the CEO stays in power by the end of the quarter, or the CEO leaves and is no longer in power by the end of the quarter. Those are the 2 conditions we have for these 2 stock markets. So in one market, the speculators will ask themselves, what is this company worth if the CEO stays? And in the other market, they will ask themselves, what is this company worth if the CEO leaves? If there's a difference in those 2 numbers, that's market consensus about whether it's worth keeping the CEO.
Okay.
Ta-da. And now we just do what they say. If it says the company's worth more without the CEO, you get rid of the CEO. If it says it's worth more keeping him, you keep him. That's it. So that's a decision market. That's this mechanism by which all we have to do is agree on our outcome measure and what the discrete options are and set up a few markets, and then those markets tell us what to do. And they don't require us to know why. That's the key point here. Here, all we needed to know is we had a decision and we wanted to know which one would give us the higher stock price. And a bunch of other smart, ambitious people will go figure things out and make bets on the basis of that. We don't need to know why, understand their reasoning. We don't need to be part of that conversation. What we need to do is decide, we want to decide this decision on the basis of this outcome. And that's it. And that's the sort of mechanism we could use at a higher level of government, wherein all you'd have to do is say, well, what is the outcome we care about? Because for every outcome that could happen, you'll need a way to come up with a number that says, this is how good it was. That's going to be some sort of formula that includes inequality and leisure and happiness and, respect and biosphere, health, and whatever else you wanted. And now you see, if you have that kind of government, your problem looks much easier. Now you just have to argue over these different relative contributions to welfare and, of course, persuade other people to agree with you about those things.
What are stocks in the governmental scenario? It's, I guess, votes or...
we would just make some process. Basically, there'd be at the moment we have what's called the Bureau of Labor Statistics, And they issue numbers of what we call GDP. GDP is a measure of just the total size of the economy. So they have certain processes by which they do surveys and look at prices, and they put that all together to their GDP number. Okay, so the idea is that national welfare would be like GDP, except looking at more stuff. Instead of just looking at GDP, we add in leisure and happiness and environment and things like that into our measure of national welfare. There'd be some formula, but they have the same sort of thing where they went out and measured things to see the values of that. So if it's something about the biosphere, they'll have to be measuring the biosphere. How many trees, what's the pH of the rivers, etc., in order to get a measure of the biosphere. And they put that all together in some measure of national welfare. So basically, for example, every year there'd be the measure of national welfare for that year for the country. And the next year there'd be another number, etc. And we just make an asset that pays out in proportion to that number. And it's like a bet, basically. And once we make that asset that pays out in proportion to that, now we can have a market in that asset and see what its price is. And that price is the estimate of that number.
That's interesting. That's fascinating. I spoke to a company called Regen, and they do something along those lines in terms of assigning the health of an environment, of certain part of the natural environment to a cryptocurrency. And basically the cryptocurrency is its value is being determined by the certain parameters. And then they're using, but they're essentially using crypto in that scenario in a somewhat similar way to encourage land stewardship.
Sure. And so this is a mechanism we can use at a wide range of scales. If you had a piece of land and you wanted to manage it for a certain purpose, you could use this mechanism that way as well. But I'm since you brought us sort of a civilization-wide question here, I thought I'd give you a civilization-wide answer.
Yeah. That's fantastic. And I don't know. I mean, how do you proceed with implementing a system like this if it were deemed that something that the population wanted? What are the steps to begin that?
So I would say the major thing the world needs to do that it's not doing is taking ideas of mechanisms like this and testing them out at small scales so that it can increase its libraries of tested mechanisms that it could then use it for larger systems. So at the moment, I would not recommend the world just immediately adopt something like this. I would instead recommend they do smaller scale tests. And, very small scale tests are quite possible here. I'm optimistic that things will do well, but you shouldn't take my word for it. You should do small scale tests. But then once small scale tests have been successful, then they would be used in smaller scale real systems like clubs and firms and, cities. And slowly over time, as people got more experience and confidence in using a system through smaller tests, they would try it on larger scale systems, and it would then naturally be adopted. You wouldn't have to have some, moment when you persuaded everybody. They would slowly get persuaded as they saw stuff work. That's how we usually persuade people to do new things. That's what they should do here. So I would say, many people like yourself want to think about what policies should we adopt in the long run. But I'd say your energies might be better spent asking what mechanisms are we neglecting, doing some small-scale experiments on those mechanisms, trying to show that some of them work, and then turning these questions over to those mechanisms. Instead of you answering the question, let those mechanisms answer the question.
Yeah, we're doing a lot of that kind of work with voting systems right now. Approval voting is a new...
Approval voting is an old idea.
Yeah.
It's a good idea. And, that doesn't take much work. I mean, a lot of people have tested approval voting. It's actually pretty well tested. I would say it's time to just use it.
Right. I like it a lot. Well,
it has only a limited value. That is, it can't reform enormous problems, but it does overcome the third party problem. It makes it much easier for a third party to be part of a race without messing up the other.
Right. Thank you for that description, and I also thank you for the somewhat hand-holding for potentially a naive, idealistic young person that might be listening to this.
Right. So my key pitch is ask what you should be idealistic about,
right,
or even ideological about. So many people are like ideological about left versus right, about school vouchers and tax rates and things like that. And I might say, well, that gets us stuck at this level where we each have to figure out which policies work and then fight over it. What we should be fighting over is this higher level process of which mechanisms are we going to use to decide what policy. And for many of those mechanisms, we never need to fight about school vouchers or taxes or other things. There's somebody else who decides that once we have that mechanism.
Interesting.
And that's good because you and I aren't very good at deciding all these policies.
Right.
And that part of our problem of our world is we are relying on ordinary people's opinions on a lot of topics to figure out what to do. And that just goes badly.
And we're just entering into it's been so recently that we've been entering into an age where technology is enabling us to implement these sorts of systems as well.
I got to say, the thing I'm describing could have been done long a time ago. A lot of approval voting could have been done a long time ago, but there's just a lot of things that we don't do that could have been done a long time ago. Technology wasn't the limiting factor.
Interesting. And just to make sure I understand it correctly, because we're also interested in how do we help facilitate a healthier scientific environment, in which we're searching for, provide incentive models for people to search for the answers to big ideas and to big questions. And you have described in other conversations something called idea futures, where you're making betting markets for ideas in the future. Let's say you put out there that, what is the actual mass of a neutron or something along those lines. And then people, there's some sort of monetary incentive for people to try to find that answer and continue to hone in on not allowing something to be assumed as correct. Can you explain that a little bit? How does that mechanism work?
Okay, so there's this general idea of a betting market. And a betting market is a nice, simple mechanism for answering a question like, which horse will win a horse race, or what is the mass of the electron, or a wide range of other specific questions, like which treatment better addresses cancer or something. So one way to use betting markets is just when you have a question, like which treatment best addresses cancer, or even which policy to adopt for the nation, you just take the betting market answer and use it as your answer. Now, that's a good way to take the best current estimate and find it and use it, but it doesn't necessarily give you strong incentives to create better new estimates. So another thing you could do is you could subsidize one of these markets. So that is, you can create a dumb market maker who basically just automatically makes trades, and it's not so dumb that it loses money just to anybody who trades to it. It only loses money to those who actually get new information and trade with it. And so that creates what I've called an information prize. It's a prize to anybody who can come and better address this question, i.e. find out an answer earlier than somebody else. So say our best estimate right now is 53 on something. You spend millions of dollars and figure out our best estimate is actually 55. Well, what you do is you privately go bet, you move the price up from 53 to 55, and then you release your results and convince everybody that in fact it should be 55. Then you can undo your bet at a profit and make up for the money it cost you to do this research. So the thicker the market, that is, the harder it is to move the price in terms of how much money it takes, the more money you make by moving the price a given amount, and the more reward there is then for somebody who figured out the answer and got paid for it this way. So it's related to other prizes. That is, you can have accomplishments prizes. And we've done that in the past, like whoever invents a refrigerator that has a certain energy efficiency, then we give them so much money. And, this is a way to use betting markets to create information prizes. There's the question, though, of whether this goes as far enough. So if we think about the grand world of conversation we have today and all the things people talk about and all the incentives they do or don't have to contribute well to those conversations, science is one part of those conversations. And we might ask is, what's a good institution for promoting those conversations and getting people to do better? So what I've just described so far, I would say is a good contribution, but it's not. So it doesn't solve all these problems. So there are many topics on which we argue where it's kind of hard to come up with a bet that we could settle anytime soon. And that's a problem with these sort of very short-term bet things. And there's often a lot of topics where we discuss where we're kind of vague and not even sure what we're saying, but fumbling with our language and concepts. And that, of course, also makes it hard to settle bets there. And if you go to academics, professors like myself in academia, if you tell them we want to reward you guys for these prizes these accomplishment prizes and these sort of very specific prizes about, near-term things we could measure, their complaint back will be, well, that's the low status stuff. We're the higher status people doing the more interesting, impressive things, and your mechanisms don't help very well with our stuff. And so then the question will be, well, how can we make something that works better for their stuff? Because, most journalists who want to quote somebody for a newspaper, or students who want to go to a school with impressive things, they like to go to places and talk to people with those impressive stuff. And those are less amenable to these sorts of prizes, unfortunately. So we could either just fund science through these less impressive stuff and say, hey, tough, if you want money, you're going to have to, do this other stuff. I don't think that'll work, because there's just other people willing to give the money for other reasons. You aren't going to be able to make a cartel that limits the other kinds of money. And a lot of the other kind of money that goes to these people is not very many strings attached. People just are willing to give money to Harvard, say, because it's Harvard. They don't that much care what they do with the money. And therefore, people there just have to make sure they stay Harvard, i.e. retain the perception that everybody thinks they're the best. So now there's a challenge. How could we intervene in that process and get those people to be more attentive to the truth, say, and what matters? So I've thought about that a lot for a long time, and I have a proposal, but it's a little complicated.
Okay.
It's more complicated than what I just showed you about the decision markets.
Okay.
But I think it has a shot of work.
Do you have time?
I do.
Okay.
So let me describe it. It won't probably take more than 5 minutes. Okay, so my concept is to go after the thing those people would say is the justification for their existence. And that is, they would say, we're the people who are doing the stuff that a century from now, when people look back, they will say, that was the good stuff. Okay? We are the people doing that stuff. History will say our topics and research was the most fundamental, the most insightful, the most groundbreaking. That's the stuff we do. And then they will say your prizes and interim measures, they aren't getting it. That's why you should just trust us and give us the money. We'll do it. We'll do it our way. So I want to get at that concept. So here's my proposal. First of all, I want to get a bunch of historians, pay them well, to study science and academia a century ago, or even 2 centuries ago. Take some group of researchers at the time on some topic and ask the historians to study those people in carefully and say, now that we're looking back on what they were doing, we can first ask which of them were actually doing the most interesting stuff, the most important stuff, the stuff that was the most influential or should have been the most influential if only people had paid more attention to it, and take some group of 100 researchers, or maybe even 1,000, and rank them according to who was more versus less important in the long run. We're going to take this long run view, look back at them, and rank those people. We're going to do this for a dozen different areas, and then we're going to do multiple groups out of each area and have them do it independently and see how much they agree.
Okay, interesting.
Okay, and now we're going to check to see if this is a thing that can be done. Can we reliably have a method by which we look at old research from a century ago and make this judgment, which is the justification that they're making at the time for why they are important, of what does history say about them? We're going to do this thing where we say, history's going to say about you who is more important.
And like apply like a numerical metric to...
Yes, the sorting is going to give you the number. I'm going to force them to rank them, right? Put them in an order. Who's best, who's worst? Stretch it out. That you can make a numerical ranking out of that, but the key thing is to make them rank them. Okay? If there's people they can't tell, well, fine, they can put them in the same ranking, but rank them.
Can I just quickly clarify? So it's the ranking that today's society puts on one in terms of how successful,
right?
How important their discoveries were compared to what they claimed at the time.
We don't need to know what they claimed.
Okay.
All we need to know is what we think.
Okay, interesting.
about who was more important. Now, if we like, we can say, well, let's use the kind of standards they would have used instead of the kind of standards we would use, maybe. That's fine. I don't know which way we should go in that. But the key thing is, and there's probably a bunch of different ways historians can do this, and we should just try different ways and see how robust they are, which ones correlate. And the point is now to have a menu of ways that we could, in fact, evaluate the past. Okay. The purpose of doing this is now we're going to make markets today and what that measure will be a century from now. We're going to take all the academics, all the researchers, and have a betting market on what their ranking will be. If a century from now, we rank them. That's the key point. And we will have shown that it's possible, and we're going to fund it. We're going to make sure it's going to be done for some people. It might not be done for everybody, but some random sample of people will show up and be ranked. Maybe 10%, 1%, doesn't that much matter. The point is, we're going to have a market in everybody today, and if they were ranked later, what will that ranking be? So now everybody today has this market estimate of their expected future value according to the standards people today say they should be judged by, right? That's the reason for existing. That's their justification now. We are the people doing the stuff that matters in the long run. And you say, according to these markets, this is where you're ranked on that thing you say you care about. And now you see if a place like Harvard has a set of 5 candidates for a job and they hire one, and if it's not the highest person on that ranking, we've got some questions. So they'll either have to defy these market estimates sometimes and say that's just all wrong, or they'll have to be pressured to actually hire the person ranked highest, or actually go spend money to make sure they are ranked highest, because the idea is we're not necessarily going to trust them over this market because, hey, they could go better in this market because we've got our best capitalists in this market. And the more that we trust this market as an estimate of this future thing, the more that academics will be pressured to make their choices of who to hire, who to fund, who to publish, more in accordance with these market estimates of who's actually going to be most important. And that would answer your question. So now the most prestigious academics are going to actually try to be useful with respect to this future measure of who actually mattered. And it's open because all these numbers are open, and most of academia is open in the sense that people publish openly. And so the problem with science today isn't so much that it's not open, as more that it's not actually trying to be effective.
Right. The incentive models are much different.
Right. So this is my proposed solution within 5 minutes as promised.
Nice.
To reform academia. But see, this is a little more complicated because this is a world based on a certain kind of prestige. And they say, no, we're the best people according to our concept of who eventually will matter. That's what we're judging each other on. That's what you should trust us on. And they push back on any other metric to judge them by. And so I'm going to say, fine, we're judging you by that metric. But here's a market estimate of how you judge by that metric. Dare you defy it?
Oh, man. Okay. I'm going to need to unpack that, and I probably will.
I have a blog post I can link to.
And by the way, your blog is fantastic. I'm going to post it in the show notes. I'm loving it. The last couple posts, especially in the last 2 weeks, have been excellent. There's so much to unpack with you and so much to discuss, and I need to be respectful of your time. Thank you, Robin, so much for your time today. It's been wonderful.
Well, it's been nice to talk, and I'd be happy to talk again.
Oh, that'd be wonderful. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you. And I'm going to share everything on the show notes. So, everyone, please jump in there and check out Robin's stuff. It's really amazing writing. It really is. And I'm just getting started on it. Have a good day, Robin.
Take care.